The stone floor was cold under Alira's knees, and the laughter above her was colder still. She had been carrying a basket of firewood across the courtyard when Nora's foot shot out from nowhere. The wood scattered in every direction, clattering against the stones, and Alira went down hard, her palms scraping against the rough ground. For a moment she just knelt there, staring at her stinging hands, while the sound of laughter rolled over her like a wave. "Look at her," Nora said, tossing her dark hair over one shoulder. "She can't even walk straight. What good is a servant who can't even speak to apologize?" More laughter. A few of the younger pack members who had gathered near the well turned to watch, some smirking, some looking away in discomfort but saying nothing. Nobody ever said anything. That was the way of Wolfsbane pack. Cruelty was allowed as long as it wore a smile. Alira gathered the scattered wood without looking up. Her chest burned, not from the fall, but from the old, familiar shame that came with being laughed at in front of others. She had lived with silence for 6 years now, ever since the fever took her voice when she was 16. 6 years of being spoken over, spoken about, and spoken down to, as though her silence made her invisible, as though a voice was the only thing that made a person real. She picked up the last piece of firewood and rose to her feet, refusing to let her eyes water in front of them. She would not give Nora the satisfaction. "Nothing to say, as usual," Nora said, delighted with herself. Behind her stood 2 of her friends, Ivy and Callista, girls who laughed whenever Nora laughed, and fell silent whenever Nora fell silent, as though they had no thoughts of their own. It must be nice. Never having to answer for anything, never having to explain yourself. Alira met her eyes for one long moment. She did not smile, did not flinch, did not look away. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen entrance, the basket balanced against her hip, her spine straight despite the ache in her palms. Behind her, she heard Nora mutter something to her friends, followed by another ripple of laughter. Alira did not turn around. She had long ago learned that turning around only fed the fire. The kitchen was warm, and smelled of rosemary and baking bread, and for a moment, stepping through the door, felt like stepping into another world entirely. Hannah stood at the counter, flour dusted across her apron, humming a tune under her breath. She looked up when Alira entered, and her humming stopped immediately. "What happened to your hands?" Hannah asked, setting down her rolling pin and crossing the room in 3 quick steps. She took Alira's hands in hers, turning them over gently to examine the raw, reddened skin. Alira shook her head, a small motion meant to say it does not matter, but Hannah was already reaching for a cloth and a bowl of cool water. "Was it Nora again?" Hannah asked, though she did not really need to ask. There was only ever one answer to that question in Wolfsbane pack. Alira nodded once, and Hannah's jaw tightened. Of all the pack members, Hannah was the only one who had never once treated Alira's silence as a flaw to be mocked. They had grown up together, daughters of servants, learning the same signs and gestures Alira's grandmother had taught them both as children, back when Alira could still speak, and the 2 of them had invented their own secret language just for fun. Now that language was not a game. It was Alira's only way of being heard. One day, Hannah signed, her hands moving with quiet fury as she dabbed the cloth against Alira's palms. "Someone is going to put that girl in her place, and I hope I am there to see it." Alira allowed herself a small, tired smile. She signed back, slow and simple, "Not today." "No," Hannah agreed, setting the cloth aside. "But someday." Neither of them knew, in that ordinary moment in the warm kitchen, just how soon someday would arrive. News had come 3 days earlier that the Alpha King was traveling through the northern territories, visiting the packs one by one to renew old alliances and forge new ones. Every pack he visited trembled a little at the news, because King Draven was not a ruler who forgave weakness, disorder, or disrespect. He commanded not just Wolfsbane pack, but every pack across the kingdom, and the stories about him were the kind that made children sit a little straighter, and adults choose their words a little more carefully. They said he had taken the throne young, after his father's death, and that within a year he had unified territories that had been fighting each other for generations. They said his eyes could see through lies, the way a hawk saw a mouse in tall grass. They said he never raised his voice, because he never needed to. A single look from him was enough to silence a room. Wolfsbane pack had spent the past 3 days in a frenzy of preparation. The Alpha, Edmund, a broad-shouldered man with silver threading through his beard, had ordered the halls scrubbed, the banners replaced, and the finest food prepared for the ceremony that would mark the king's visit. Every servant in the pack house had been given extra duties, and Alira was no exception. If anything, she had been given more, as though her silence made her invisible enough to be overworked without complaint. She did not mind the work itself. She minded the way Nora's father, one of Edmund's closest advisors, had made a point of assigning her the most menial tasks, as though positioning her carefully out of sight, a servant not fit to be seen by important eyes. She minded the whispered comment she had overheard the night before, when Nora had told her friends that she hoped the mute girl would have the good sense to stay in the kitchens during the ceremony, where she belonged. Alira had not planned to attend the ceremony at all. She had planned to stay in the kitchens, exactly where Nora wanted her, safely out of sight, safely unseen. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The morning of the king's arrival dawned clear and bright, the kind of crisp autumn morning that made the Packlands look almost beautiful, despite everything ugly that lived within them. Alira woke before dawn, as she always did, and made her way to the small garden behind the pack house, where she grew herbs for the healers. It was the one place in Wolfsbane pack that felt entirely her own, a quiet patch of earth, where nobody bothered to mock her, because nobody bothered to come at all. She knelt among the rows of chamomile and lavender, her fingers moving carefully through the soil, checking for the tender green shoots that would need harvesting soon. The work was slow and required patience, and patience was something Alira had in abundance. 6 years of silence had taught her to notice things other people rushed past. She noticed the way the frost clung to the edges of the leaves. She noticed the particular gray of the sky before the sun broke through. She noticed, more than anyone in the pack house seemed to realize, exactly how people around her behaved when they thought no one of consequence was watching. She was halfway through checking the lavender when a shadow fell across the garden. She looked up, expecting Hannah, and instead found herself looking at Garrick, the pack's healer, an older man with kind eyes and a limp from an old injury. He held a folded piece of parchment in one hand. "Alira," he said, and then, remembering himself, made the small gesture with his hand that meant good morning in their shared sign language. Garrick had learned it years ago, when Alira first lost her voice, insisting that a healer, who could not communicate with all his patients, was only half a healer. "I need your help today. The Alpha wants extra healing supplies prepared, in case any old wounds act up during the ceremony from all this excitement, and I am afraid my hands are not what they used to be for the fine work." Alira nodded, rising and brushing the soil from her knees. She followed him toward the healing house, where jars and vials lined the shelves in careful rows, each one labeled in Garrick's careful handwriting. Working with Garrick was one of the few unqualified joys in Alira's daily life. He never once treated her differently for her silence. If anything, he seemed to trust her judgment more than most, often asking her opinion on which herbs to blend for which ailments, nodding thoughtfully at her signed suggestions, as though she were a healer in training, rather than a servant girl who happened to know plants. They worked through the morning in comfortable quiet, grinding dried herbs, measuring tinctures, preparing bandages. Alira's hands moved with practiced ease, and for a while, she almost forgot about the ceremony that loomed ahead, almost forgot about Nora's threats and the king's impending arrival. It was Garrick who broke the peace, glancing toward the window where the sound of horns had begun to carry across the Packlands. "He's here," Garrick said quietly, setting down his mortar and pestle. "The king has arrived." Alira felt her stomach tighten, though she could not have said exactly why. She had no reason to fear the king's arrival. She was nobody to him, a servant girl who would spend the ceremony in the kitchens, exactly as Nora wished. And yet something in the air had shifted, some current she could not name, as though the whole pack house had drawn in a single breath and was waiting to release it. "You should come," Garrick said, surprising her. "To the courtyard. Just for a moment. Everyone will be there, and it would look strange if the healer's assistant was the only one missing." Alira hesitated, thinking of Nora's whispered warning from the night before. But Garrick was right. If she was noticeably absent, it would only give Nora another opportunity to make a scene, to point out the missing mute girl who did not know her place. Better to stand quietly at the edges, unseen among the crowd, than to give anyone a reason to single her out. She nodded, and together they made their way toward the courtyard. The scene that greeted them took Alira's breath away. Despite everything she had heard, the entire pack had gathered, dressed in their finest clothing, forming two long lines along the path that led from the gates to the pack house steps. Banners bearing the crest of Wolfsbane Pack hung from every window, fluttering gently in the crisp autumn breeze. At the head of the crowd stood Alpha Edmund, flanked by his advisors, his chest puffed out with the particular pride of a man about to be inspected by someone more powerful than himself. And then, through the gates, came the king's procession. Alira had imagined many things about the Alpha King, based on the stories she had heard. She had imagined someone imposing, someone whose very presence commanded fear. What she had not imagined was the particular quality of stillness that surrounded him, the way the entire courtyard seemed to grow quieter as he approached, not from fear alone, but from something closer to awe. King Draven was tall, taller than any man Alira had seen in Wolfsbane Pack, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. He wore no elaborate crown, no ostentatious jewels, only simple dark clothing that somehow commanded more respect than any decoration could have. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed to prove his strength, because everyone around him already understood it. He walked the length of the courtyard with Alpha Edmund at his side, nodding occasionally as Edmund gestured toward this building or that, clearly narrating some history of the Packlands. Draven's expression remained composed throughout, polite but unreadable, the expression of a man who had heard 100 such tours, and would hear 100 more, before his reign was through. Alira stood near the back of the crowd, half hidden behind Garrick's shoulder, watching with the same curiosity as everyone else. She told herself she would slip away soon, back to the kitchens where she belonged, before anyone had the chance to notice her. But then Nora appeared. She emerged from the crowd near the front, dressed in a deep green gown that had clearly been chosen for the occasion, her dark hair elaborately braided. She curtsied low before the king, and Alira watched with a familiar, weary dread as Nora began speaking, her voice pitched to Carrie, clearly hoping to draw the king's attention and favor. Alira could not hear every word from where she stood, but she caught enough. Nora was recounting some story, likely exaggerated, about her own supposed accomplishments within the pack, positioning herself as indispensable to Edmund's rule. It was the kind of performance Nora excelled at, charming on the surface, calculated underneath. And then, as though the story required a punchline, Nora's eyes swept the crowd and landed on Alira. "Even our servants know their place here," Nora said, her voice bright and cutting, loud enough now for the whole courtyard to hear. "Take that one, for instance." She pointed directly at Alira, and every head in the courtyard turned. "She can't speak a single word, not one. Isn't that remarkable? She just stands there, silent as a stone, no matter what happens around her." A ripple of laughter moved through parts of the crowd, the same familiar, cruel laughter Alira had endured 1,000 times before. Her cheeks burned as every eye in the courtyard settled on her, and for one terrible moment she felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life, exposed in front of not just her own pack, but the most powerful man in the kingdom. "Go on," Nora said, gesturing toward Alira with mock encouragement, playing to the crowd now, clearly enjoying every second of the attention. "Say something." "Oh, that's right. She can't." More laughter, louder this time. Alira felt Garrick shift beside her, saw him open his mouth as though to defend her, but she reached out and touched his arm gently, a silent request to let it be. Fighting back would only prolong the humiliation. Better to let it pass, as she always did, and disappear back into the shadows where Nora seemed to think she belonged. But as Alira stood there, humiliation burning through her chest, something shifted in her. Perhaps it was the accumulation of 6 years of laughter just like this. Perhaps it was simply that she was tired, bone-tired, of shrinking herself to make other people comfortable with her silence. Whatever the reason, instead of lowering her eyes and stepping back into the crowd as she always did, Alira did something she had never done in front of an audience this large. She raised her chin, looked directly at Nora, and lifted her hand. Slowly, deliberately, with the same grace her grandmother had taught her years ago, she made a gesture. Her fingers moved in a pattern both delicate and precise, An old sign. One she rarely used, because so few people understood its meaning. It was not an insult, not a defense, but something older and quieter than either. A gesture of dignity. A gesture that said, without a single sound, I see you, and I am not ashamed. The laughter in the crowd faltered, uncertain what to make of the unfamiliar motion. Nora blinked, clearly thrown by the fact that Alira had not simply lowered her head as expected. And then, from the front of the courtyard, near where the king stood beside Alpha Edmund, came a sound that silenced everyone. It was the sound of King Draven rising fully to his feet, though he had not been seated, the sound of every eye in the courtyard turning toward him instead, drawn by some shift in his energy that everyone could feel even before they understood why. He was staring at Alira, not with confusion, not with mild curiosity, but with an intensity that made the entire courtyard hold its breath. His storm-gray eyes had gone wide, then narrow, fixed on her raised hand, as though he had seen a ghost. The silence stretched, unbearable and electric, until finally, the Alpha King did something no one in that courtyard had ever seen him do. He raised his own hand, and with slow, deliberate care, he answered her gesture with one of his own. The exact same sign. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Nora's confident smile crumbled into something closer to shock. Alpha Edmund's mouth fell open. Even Garrick, standing beside Alira, made a small sound of disbelief. Alira herself stood frozen, her hand still raised, staring at the king across the crowded courtyard, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Because that sign, the one she had just used without thinking, without planning, the one her grandmother had told her was old and rare and belonged to a nearly forgotten tradition, was not something a stranger should have known. And yet the most powerful man in the kingdom had just answered it perfectly, as though he had been waiting his entire life for someone to give him the chance. The courtyard remained silent, every person present sensing that something had just happened that none of them fully understood, something that would change everything that came after. King Draven lowered his hand slowly, his eyes never leaving Alira's face, and in that lingering, weighted silence, the first thread of a story neither of them could yet imagine began, quietly, to unravel. No one moved. No one spoke. The courtyard of Wolfsbane Pack, moments ago filled with the easy cruelty of Nora's laughter, had become a held breath, every man and woman frozen in place, as they tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Alpha Edmund was the first to break the silence, though his voice came out strangled, uncertain, in a way Alira had never heard from him before. "Your Majesty," he said, stepping slightly toward the king, "is something wrong?" Draven did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Alira, who stood rooted to the spot, her hand slowly lowering back to her side, her heart pounding so hard, she was certain everyone around her could hear it. She had no idea what she had just done, no idea why the most powerful man in the kingdom was looking at her as though she were the only person in the courtyard. "That gesture," Draven finally said, his voice quiet, but carrying easily across the silent courtyard. "Where did you learn it?" The question was directed at Alira, and for a moment, panic rose in her chest. She could not answer him with words. She never could. But before she could decide how to respond, Nora, recovering some of her composure, stepped forward with a bright, nervous laugh. "Your Majesty, forgive her. She cannot speak. She's mute. I was just explaining that to you a moment ago. She probably doesn't even understand what you're asking." Draven's gaze shifted to Nora, and something in his expression made her laugh die in her throat. "I did not ask you," he said, his voice not raised, not angry, simply final. "I asked her." He took several steps forward, closing the distance across the courtyard, and the crowd parted before him without needing to be told. Alira watched him approach, her pulse racing, unsure whether to feel fear or something else entirely, something she could not yet name. When he stopped in front of her, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes, the entire courtyard seemed to fade into the background. Up close, the intensity of his gaze was almost overwhelming, but there was something else there too, beneath the authority, something that looked almost like hope. "Can you understand signs?" he asked, and this time, instead of speaking aloud, he lifted his hands and repeated the question in the same silent language she had used moments before. Alira's breath caught. She nodded, slowly, and then, gathering her courage, she signed back. "Yes, My grandmother taught me, and my friend. Draven watched her hands with an intensity that made her fingers tremble slightly, though she forced herself to finish the thought clearly. When she lowered her hands, he remained silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes distant, as though he were looking through her at something from long ago. Your grandmother, he repeated quietly, more to himself than to her. Is she still living? Illyra shook her head. She had passed 3 years earlier, an illness that had taken her slowly over the course of a hard winter. Illyra signed the simple explanation, watching Draven's face carefully as she did, uncertain what any of this meant to him, why a king would care so deeply about the origins of a gesture from a servant girl he had never met. I am sorry for your loss, Draven said, and there was something genuine in the words, something that cut through the formal courtesy such phrases usually carried. He was quiet again, and Illyra could see him working through some private struggle, deciding how much to say, how much to reveal in front of an audience that was clearly hanging on every word and gesture passing between them. Finally, he turned to Alpha Edmund, who had been watching the exchange with an expression of complete bewilderment. I would like to speak with her privately, Draven said, after the ceremony concludes. Edmund blinked rapidly, clearly scrambling to process the request. Of course, Your Majesty, whatever you require. Though I should mention, she is only a servant, one of the kitchen staff. She has no formal standing to. I am aware of her position, Draven interrupted, not unkindly, but with enough finality that Edmund fell silent immediately. That does not concern me. He turned back to Illyra one final time before stepping away to continue the formal ceremony, and though he said nothing more aloud, his eyes carried a promise that made her stomach twist, with a mixture of nerves and something she could not quite identify. Later, his eyes seemed to say, we will speak later. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur for Illyra. She stood near the back of the crowd, going through the motions of watching the formal proceedings, the exchange of gifts between Edmund and the king, the speeches about alliance and loyalty, but none of it truly registered. Her mind kept circling back to the moment in the courtyard, to the king's storm-gray eyes fixed on her hands, to the strange, aching quality in his voice when he had asked about her grandmother. Beside her, Hannah had appeared at some point during the confusion, having pushed her way through the crowd to reach Illyra's side. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and barely contained excitement. What just happened? Hannah signed frantically, once they had a moment of relative privacy near the edge of the crowd. The Alpha King himself? Answering your sign? Illyra, do you understand what this means? Illyra shook her head slowly. I don't understand anything. He asked where I learned it. He seemed to recognize it. Recognize it how? I don't know, but he wants to speak with me. After the ceremony. Hannah's mouth fell open. Before she could respond, however, a sharp voice cut through their quiet exchange. How touching, Nora said, appearing beside them with her usual entourage trailing behind her. Her earlier bright confidence had curdled into something colder, sharper. The mute girl gets a moment of attention from a king who was clearly just being polite, and suddenly, she thinks she's someone important. Illyra did not respond, but Hannah rounded on Nora with a fierceness that surprised even Illyra. You saw what happened just as clearly as the rest of us, Hannah said. That was not politeness. The king rose from his seat. He crossed the entire courtyard for her. When has he ever done that for anyone else here today? Nora's cheeks flushed with anger, but before she could respond, one of Edmund's advisors called for the noble families to gather for the formal feast, and the crowd began to disperse. Nora shot one last venomous look at Illyra before turning away, her friends hurrying to keep pace with her. She's going to make your life difficult, Hannah signed once Nora was out of earshot. You know that, don't you? Illyra nodded grimly. She knew Nora well enough to understand that public humiliation, once flipped into public attention for Illyra, would only fuel Nora's resentment further, but there was little to be done about it now. What was done was done. The king had noticed her, and whatever came next, there was no undoing it. The feast that followed stretched long into the afternoon, and Illyra spent most of it in the kitchens, exactly where she had originally expected to be, helping Hannah and the other kitchen staff prepare and serve course after course to the gathered nobility. It was strange, moving through the familiar rhythms of kitchen work, while her mind remained fixed on the promise of a private conversation still to come. Several times she caught herself pausing mid-task, staring at nothing, replaying the moment in the courtyard over and over, trying to understand what it meant. It was well into the evening, after the feast had finally wound down and most of the pack had retired for the night, when Garrick found her in the herb garden, where she had gone to steady her nerves among the familiar rows of chamomile and lavender. "The king has requested your presence," Garrick said gently, his weathered face creased with concern. "In the private study, off the main hall. I offered to accompany you, if you would like." Alira hesitated only a moment before nodding gratefully. The thought of facing the Alpha King entirely alone, after everything that had happened that day, was more than she felt prepared for. They walked together through the quiet corridors of the pack house, the sounds of the feast's aftermath fading behind them, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Alira's hands felt cold despite the warmth of the evening, her mind racing through 100 possibilities for what the king might want, none of which made any sense to her. The private study was a small room, warmly lit by a low fire, its shelves lined with books and old maps. King Draven stood near the window when they entered, his back to the door, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dying light outside. He turned as they approached, and for a moment, his composed, regal bearing seemed to slip, revealing something more uncertain underneath. "Thank you for coming," he said, his eyes moving between Alira and Garrick. "Please, sit." Garrick guided Alira to a chair near the fire, before taking a seat of his own nearby, close enough to offer support, but far enough to allow the conversation to unfold, without his constant interference. Draven remained standing for a moment longer, as though gathering his thoughts, before finally taking the seat across from them. "I owe you an explanation for my behavior this afternoon," he began, his voice quieter now than it had been in the courtyard, stripped of its formal authority. "I imagine it must have seemed strange, even alarming, for the king to react so strongly to a simple gesture." Alira nodded carefully, waiting. "When I was a boy," Draven continued, his eyes drifting toward the fire, as though the memory itself lived somewhere in the flames. "Before I was ever meant to inherit the throne, I was very ill. Sicker than anyone expected me to survive. My father brought in healers from every corner of the kingdom, and none of them could help. It was a woman who finally saved my life, a healer who could not speak." Alira's breath caught. Beside her, she felt Garrick go very still. "She stayed with me for nearly a year," Draven continued, "nursing me back to health, teaching me things no one else had the patience to teach a sick, frightened child. She taught me to sign, so that I would have a way to communicate during the months when the fever left my throat too raw to speak. The gesture you used today, that was hers. She used it every morning, a kind of greeting, a way of saying good morning, I see you, without needing a single word." Alira felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she could not have said exactly why the story affected her so deeply. "I have not seen that gesture in over 20 years, Draven said quietly. "I thought it had been lost, along with her, when she left our household after I recovered. I never learned what became of her. My father never spoke of her again, and by the time I was old enough to ask questions, all trace of her had vanished. I have wondered, for most of my life, whether I imagined the depth of what she taught me, whether it truly mattered the way it felt like it did at the time." He paused, meeting Alira's eyes directly. "And then today, in a courtyard hundreds of miles from where I grew up, a young woman I had never met used that exact gesture, without hesitation, as though it were the most natural response in the world." Alira sat in stunned silence, processing everything he had said. Slowly she raised her hands and began to sign, watching his face carefully as she formed the words. "My grandmother taught me everything I know." She said the language belonged to a healer she once knew, long ago, before I was born. She never told me the healer's name. Draven leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening with sudden intensity. "Do you know where your grandmother learned it? Where she lived before she came to Wolfsbane Pack?" Alira shook her head slowly, frustrated by the limits of her own knowledge. She had never asked. As a child, she had simply accepted her grandmother's teachings as a gift, a secret language shared between them, without ever wondering about its origins. Garrick, who had been listening quietly throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "If I may, Your Majesty. Alira's grandmother, Marin, came to Wolfsbane Pack many years before Alira was born. I remember her, though only vaguely, from when I was very young myself. She kept largely to herself. There were always rumors about her past, though nothing confirmed. Some said she had once served in a royal household, though no one ever knew for certain. Draven's eyes widened slightly at this information, and Alira could see him turning the pieces over in his mind, trying to fit them together into some larger picture. "I would like to learn more," Draven said finally, his voice steadying with renewed purpose. "About your grandmother. About where she came from, and what connection, if any, exists between her and the healer who saved my life." He looked at Alira with an earnestness that struck her deeply, so different from the cold authority she had expected from a king. "Would you be willing to help me understand? I know it is a strange request, coming from a stranger, and a king no less, but I feel, somehow, that this is not simply a coincidence." Alira considered the request carefully. Everything about the day had been strange, unexpected, tilting the careful, quiet world she had built for herself into something entirely unfamiliar. And yet, sitting across from this powerful man who had shown her more genuine curiosity and respect in a single conversation than most of Wolfsbane Pack had shown her in 6 years, she found herself nodding. "Yes," she signed. "I will help however I can." A small, genuine smile broke across Draven's face, transforming his features entirely, softening the sharp authority into something warmer, something almost boyish in its relief. "Thank you," he said simply, and in that quiet study, lit by the glow of a dying fire, something had shifted between them, something neither of them could have named, but both of them could feel. Outside, the Packlands settled into night, unaware that within those walls, the beginning of a story that would change everything had just quietly, irrevocably begun. The days that followed the king's arrival changed the rhythm of Wolfsbane Pack in ways no one could have predicted. What was meant to be a brief diplomatic visit stretched into a longer stay, with Draven citing the need to review old alliance documents and inspect the Pack's northern borders before continuing his journey through the territories. No one questioned the reasoning aloud, though whispers followed him through every corridor, speculation about the true purpose behind his extended presence. Alira found herself summoned to the private study nearly every evening, always with Garrick present, as Draven pressed for any detail she could recall about her grandmother, Marin. Alira dug through old memories she had not visited in years, searching for fragments that might help piece together the mystery that had settled over both of them like a shared secret. She used to hum while she worked, Alira signed one evening, sitting near the fire, while Draven listened with the same rapt attention he gave every detail she offered. Old songs, in a language I never recognized. I used to ask her what the words meant, but she would just smile and tell me some things were better left as music than meaning. Draven's eyes softened at this. The healer who cared for me hummed as well. I remember it clearly, even now. It used to help me sleep, on the nights the fever was at its worst. "Do you remember any of the tune?" Alira asked. Draven closed his eyes for a moment, and then, hesitantly, he began to hum, low and soft, a melody that carried an ancient, mournful beauty. Alira felt her chest tighten as she listened, because though she could not place the exact tune, something in its shape, its rhythm, felt achingly familiar, as though her body remembered what her mind could not quite grasp. "I think I have heard something like that before," she signed slowly, when he finished. "Though I cannot be certain, it has been years since I last heard my grandmother hum." These evening conversations became, over the following days, something Alira found herself looking forward to, with an intensity that both comforted and unsettled her. There was something remarkable about being truly listened to, about having someone lean forward with genuine interest every time her hands moved to form words, rather than the impatient, dismissive glances she had grown used to receiving from most of Wolfsbane Pack. Draven, for his part, seemed equally struck by the ease of their conversations. Unlike the endless political maneuvering that filled most of his days, unlike the careful, calculated words of advisors and nobles who always seemed to want something from him, his conversations with Alira felt entirely free of pretense. She could not flatter him even if she wished to, could not manipulate him with clever words, because every thought she shared came through the same slow, deliberate, honest medium. "You are very direct," he told her one evening, after she had signed a blunt correction to something he had assumed about the healing properties of a particular herb Garrick had mentioned. Most people who speak with me choose their words very carefully. It is refreshing to have someone simply tell me when I am wrong. Elira allowed herself a small smile at this, signing back. Words take too much effort to waste on flattery. Draven laughed at that, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even him. Garrick, watching from his usual seat near the fire, exchanged a knowing glance with no one in particular, a small smile playing at the corners of his own mouth. Not everyone in Wolfsbane Pack shared in the warmth of these developments, however. Nora's resentment, rather than fading with time, seemed to sharpen with every day that passed, fed by the growing rumors circulating through the pack house about the king's evening visits with the mute servant girl. "It's disgraceful," Nora complained to her father one afternoon, her voice carrying through the thin walls of the study, where Elira happened to be delivering a stack of freshly laundered linens. A king, spending his evenings with a servant who cannot even hold a proper conversation. What could they possibly be discussing, night after night? Nora's father, a thin, calculating man named Silas, who served as one of Edmund's chief advisors, made a soothing sound. "It is likely nothing more than curiosity, my dear. The king has always had unusual interests. It will pass in time, once he grows bored, as men in his position often do." "It had better pass quickly," Nora said, her voice sharp with irritation. "The alliance ceremony next season is meant to secure my betrothal to one of the visiting lords from the Eastern Pacts. I will not have my prospects damaged because the king has developed some strange fascination with a girl who cannot even properly introduce herself in company." Elira, standing frozen in the hallway outside, absorbed this information with a growing unease. She had not considered, in the whirlwind of the past several days, how her sudden and unexpected proximity to the king might be perceived by those with more at stake in the pack's political fortunes. She had simply been grateful for the evenings of genuine conversation, for the strange, unexpected friendship that seemed to be forming between herself and a man she had never imagined she would come to know. But politics, she was quickly learning, cared little for genuine friendship. That evening, when she arrived at the private study for their usual conversation, she found herself more hesitant than before, her mind still replaying the overheard exchange between Nora and her father. Draven noticed immediately, his sharp eyes catching the shift in her demeanor before she had even fully settled into her chair. "Something is troubling you," he observed, setting aside the old map he had been examining, one that Garrick had unearthed from the pack archives, marked with notations of old healing houses scattered across the northern territories. Elira hesitated, unsure how to explain the tangle of concerns weighing on her. Finally she signed, slowly and carefully. "People are talking. About us. About why you spend so much time here, with me." Draven's expression grew serious, though not surprised. "I imagined they would," he said. "Does it trouble you, what they say?" Elira considered the question honestly before answering. "It is not the talking that troubles me. It is the trouble it might cause for others. I do not wish to become a source of conflict within my own pack." Draven was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are worried about the consequences to yourself, and to those around you, rather than any discomfort to your own reputation," he said finally, something like admiration coloring his voice. "That says a great deal about your character." Elira shook her head slightly, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I simply know how quickly rumors can turn cruel, in a place like this. I have seen it happen before, to others." "Then let me be clear about my intentions," Draven said, leaning forward slightly, his storm-gray eyes steady and direct. "I am here because I believe there is a genuine mystery worth uncovering, one that connects your grandmother to a woman who changed the course of my life. But I would be lying if I said that mystery was the only reason I continue to seek out your company each evening." Elira's pulse quickened at these words, uncertain how to respond. Draven, seeming to sense her uncertainty, did not press further, instead, returning the conversation to safer ground, to the old map spread across the table between them and the healing houses marked upon it. But something had shifted in that quiet acknowledgement, a truth spoken aloud that neither of them had been ready to name directly. As the evening wore on, their conversation returning to the comfortable rhythm of shared curiosity and careful, honest exchange, Elira found herself stealing glances at Draven when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way the firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, the way his expression softened whenever she signed something that made him laugh. It was, she realized with a growing sense of alarm, becoming increasingly difficult to remember that this man was a king, that their evenings together were meant to be nothing more than a shared investigation into old family history. Something else was growing alongside that investigation, something quieter and more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Later that night, walking back to the servants' quarters through the quiet, moonlit corridors of the pack house, Elira found Hannah waiting for her outside the kitchen, arms crossed, an expression of barely contained curiosity on her face. "You have been spending an awful lot of evenings in that study," Hannah signed, falling into step beside her as they walked. "I want details." Elira sighed, though a small smile tugged at her lips despite herself. "We are trying to uncover a connection between my grandmother and a healer who cared for him as a child." "Nothing more." "Nothing more," Hannah repeated skeptically, raising an eyebrow. "Elira, I have known you since we were children. I know exactly what your face looks like when nothing more is happening, and this is not that face." Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she looked away, unable to fully deny the accusation. "I knew it," Hannah signed triumphantly, though her expression quickly sobered. "Be careful, Elira. I am happy for you, truly. But he is a king. Kings do not simply fall for servant girls, not without consequences, not without enemies emerging to prevent it. And Nora will not sit quietly by while this continues to unfold." Elira nodded slowly, the weight of Hannah's warning settling over her like a heavy cloak. She knew, better than anyone, how quickly kindness could curdle into cruelty within the walls of Wolfsbane Pack. She knew how sharp Nora's tongue could be, how far her family's influence reached within the Pack's political structure. And yet, as she lay awake that night, staring up at the familiar wooden beams of the servants' quarters, she found herself replaying every moment of that evening's conversation, every unguarded smile Draven had offered her, every honest word spoken between them. Whatever danger lay ahead, whatever complications Nora and her family might attempt to create, Elira found that she could not bring herself to regret the strange, unexpected connection blossoming between herself and the Alpha King. For the first time in 6 long years of silence, someone had truly listened to her, not despite her muteness, but through it, finding meaning in every gesture, every careful, deliberate motion of her hands. And that, she realized, staring up into the darkness, was worth whatever storm might be gathering on the horizon. Outside, beyond the walls of the pack house, the autumn wind picked up, rustling through the trees that bordered the northern territories, carrying with it the first cold breath of the trouble yet to come. Nora did not wait long to act on her wounded pride. Within a week of the courtyard incident, she had begun quietly gathering allies among the pack's more influential families, spinning a narrative that painted Elira not as an innocent servant caught in unusual circumstances, but as a calculating girl who had somehow manipulated the king's attention for her own gain. "Think about it," Nora said, one afternoon, to a small gathering of noble daughters in the pack's sitting room, her voice pitched low and conspiratorial. A mute servant. Suddenly, the center of the king's attention? It does not make sense, unless she planned it somehow. Perhaps she learned that gesture on purpose, knowing it might catch his interest. One of the girls, a quiet young woman named Ivy who rarely spoke unless spoken to, frowned slightly. How would she have known what gesture would catch his interest? No one knew anything about his past with that healer until he explained it himself. Nora waved the objection away impatiently. "That is not the point. The point is that something is not right about all of this, and someone needs to bring it to the Alpha's attention before matters go too far." Word of these conversations reached Elira slowly, filtered through Hannah, who kept careful watch over the pack's gossip on Elira's behalf, understanding that Elira herself was often the last to hear what was being said about her. "She is trying to turn people against you," Hannah signed one morning, finding Elira in the herb garden before the sun had fully risen. "Careful people, people with influence. She knows she cannot simply mock you into silence anymore, not with the king's protection so visible. So she is trying a different approach." Elira's hands stilled over the rose of chamomile, a knot of anxiety forming in her chest. "What does she want people to believe? That you manipulated the king, that your silence is somehow a performance, a strategy to gain sympathy and attention." Hannah's expression was grim. "It is nonsense, of course. Anyone who has known you for more than a day, understands that you would rather disappear into the walls than draw any attention to yourself. But nonsense has a way of spreading, especially when it is repeated often enough, by people with money and standing. Illyra sat back on her heels, staring at the rich soil beneath her hands, trying to process this new threat. She had expected mockery, expected cruelty in the familiar forms she had endured for years. She had not expected calculated political maneuvering, the twisting of her genuine, unplanned connection to Draven into something sinister and manipulative. That evening, when she made her way to the private study for their now customary conversation, she found herself unusually quiet, her mind still turning over Hannah's warning. Draven noticed immediately, as he always seemed to notice the subtle shifts in her mood. "You are troubled again," he observed, setting aside the stack of old pack records he had been reviewing with Garrick's help. "Has something happened?" Illyra hesitated before signing her response, choosing her words carefully. "Nora is spreading rumors. That I have somehow manipulated your attention for my own benefit, that my silence is a performance." Draven's jaw tightened visibly at this, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features before he composed himself. "That is absurd," he said flatly. "Anyone with eyes could see the reality of the courtyard that day. I approached you, not the other way around. If anyone manipulated anything, it was circumstance itself, not you. I know that. But knowing the truth does not always stop people from believing lies, especially when the lies are convenient for those spreading them." Draven was quiet for a moment, clearly turning the problem over in his mind, with the same careful strategic focus he likely applied to matters of far greater political consequence. "Would it help?" he finally asked, "if I addressed the matter directly? A public statement, clarifying the nature of our conversations and the reason behind my continued presence here?" Illyra considered this carefully before shaking her head slowly. "I do not think that would help. It might only draw more attention to the situation, giving Nora exactly what she wants, a larger stage for her accusations." Draven nodded slowly, accepting her reasoning, though frustration still lingered in the set of his shoulders. "Then what would you have me do? I cannot simply watch you be slandered without consequence." Illyra offered a small, tired smile. "You do not need to do anything. I have endured worse than rumors before, and I will endure this as well. What matters more to me is uncovering the truth about my grandmother and the healer who cared for you. That is worth far more than defending my reputation against Nora's schemes." Draven studied her for a long moment, something in his expression softening into an emotion that looked, to Illyra's careful eye, remarkably like admiration, mixed with something deeper still. "You are remarkably resilient," he said quietly. "I have known warriors who could not endure half of what you face here, with such quiet grace." Illyra felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment, and she looked away, unsure how to respond to such open, sincere praise. "It has simply been my life, for 6 years now. I have had time to grow used to it. That does not make it right," Draven said, his voice firm. "Endurance should not be required, simply because cruelty has become familiar." The conversation shifted after that, turning back toward their shared investigation into Marin's history, though Illyra found herself unable to fully shake the weight of Draven's words. No one in Wolfsbane Pack, aside from Hannah and Garrick, had ever suggested that her endurance of cruelty was anything other than expected, a simple fact of her circumstances to be tolerated rather than challenged. Hearing Draven push back against that assumption, hearing him name the injustice of it so plainly, stirred something in her she had not realized she had been suppressing for years. Garrick, who had spent the evening quietly cross-referencing old pack records against the map of healing houses, finally looked up with an excited expression. "I believe I may have found something," he said, drawing both their attention immediately. He pointed to a small notation on the edge of the map, a healing house located in the Eastern Territories, near the border of what had once been an independent kingdom, before it was absorbed into the larger unified territories under Draven's father's rule. This healing house was known for training practitioners in what the old records call the silent tradition, a specialized branch of healing, developed specifically for those who could not speak, whether from injury, illness, or birth. "I believe both Marin and the healer who cared for you, Your Majesty, may have trained there." Draven leaned forward eagerly, examining the notation. "Is the healing house still standing?" Garrick shook his head regretfully. "I am afraid not. It was destroyed decades ago, during the territorial conflicts that preceded your father's unification of the kingdoms. Most of its records were lost. But, he added, brightening slightly, some of the healers who trained there may still be alive, scattered across the northern territories. If we could locate any of them, they might hold answers we cannot find in old, incomplete records. This new lead injected fresh energy into their investigation, and over the following days, Draven dispatched several of his most trusted scouts to search the northern territories for any surviving healers who might have trained at the destroyed healing house. Elira found herself caught up in the excitement of the search, spending long hours in the study, poring over old maps and records alongside Draven and Garrick, searching for any additional clues that might narrow their search. The work brought her and Draven into even closer proximity than before, their heads bent together over faded documents, their hands occasionally brushing as they both reached for the same map or record. Elira noticed, with a growing awareness she could not fully suppress, the way her pulse quickened whenever such small, accidental contact occurred, the way Draven's eyes would linger on her face a moment longer than strictly necessary, before returning to the documents between them. Neither of them spoke openly of whatever was growing between them, both seemingly content to let the investigation serve as a comfortable, sanctioned reason for their continued closeness. But the unspoken current beneath their conversations grew stronger with each passing evening, impossible to fully ignore no matter how much both of them focused their attention on the mystery of Meren and the silent tradition. Nora's rumors, meanwhile, continued to spread through the pack, though they had not yet reached the ears of Alpha Edmund directly, largely due to Silas's cautious insistence that the family wait for a more opportune moment to raise concerns formally. But the whispers grew louder, and Elira began to notice subtle shifts in how other pack members treated her. Wary glances from those who had previously ignored her entirely, whispered conversations that fell silent whenever she entered a room. It was during one such moment, walking through the pack house corridors with a basket of freshly laundered linens, that Elira overheard a conversation that sent a chill through her entire body. "Cannot simply allow this to continue unchecked," Silas was saying, his voice low but urgent, speaking to another of Edmund's advisors near the entrance to the main hall. "If the king's attention toward this girl becomes any more public, it could jeopardize the entire alliance ceremony planned for next season. We need to find a way to redirect his focus, quietly, before matters escalate further." "What do you propose?" the other advisor asked. Silas's voice dropped even lower, forcing Elira to strain to catch his next words. "There are ways to discourage unwanted attention, ways that do not require direct confrontation. A well-placed accusation, perhaps. Something that would require the girl's removal from the pack house entirely, for the good of pack security." Elira's blood ran cold as she processed the implication behind Silas's words. This was no longer simply a matter of rumors and whispered gossip. Silas was actively planning something, some scheme designed to remove her from Wolfsbane pack entirely, and by extension, from any further contact with the king. She hurried away before either man noticed her presence, her mind racing as she processed the danger now clearly gathering around her. She needed to warn Draven, needed to share what she had overheard before whatever scheme Silas was planning could take root. But as she made her way toward the private study that evening, her steps quick with urgency, she could not shake the growing sense that the peaceful, careful world she and Draven had built together over the past 2 weeks was about to be shattered by forces far more calculating and dangerous than simple childhood cruelty. The storm that Hannah had warned her about was no longer gathering on some distant horizon. It had arrived, and it was closing in fast. Draven listened with a darkening expression as Elira relayed everything she had overheard between Silas and the other advisor, her hands moving quickly, urgently, as she signed the details of the conversation. Garrick, seated nearby, had gone very still, his weathered face creased with concern. "He spoke of an accusation," Draven repeated, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Something that would require your removal from the pack for the sake of security." Elira nodded, her hands still trembling slightly from the effort of recalling the exact words she had overheard. "I do not know what he intends to accuse me of, but he sounded certain, prepared. This was not a passing thought. It sounded like a plan already taking shape." Draven rose from his seat and began pacing the length of the study, his movements sharp with restrained frustration. "Edmund has always struck me as a reasonable man, but if Silas is one of his closest advisors, He may have significant influence over how any accusation is received, regardless of its truth. There is something else you should consider, Your Majesty, Garrick said carefully. Silas has long harbored ambitions of expanding his family's influence within the pack. His daughter's proposed betrothal to a lord from the Eastern Pacts would secure significant political advantage, not just for Nora, but for Silas himself. Anything that threatens to complicate or delay that arrangement would be seen as a direct threat to his interests. Draven's jaw tightened further. And my continued presence here, along with my evident regard for Alira, threatens exactly that. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation settling heavily over all three of them. Alira watched Draven pace, noting the careful, controlled way he processed his anger, never allowing it to spill over into the kind of reckless outburst she might have expected from someone with his power and authority. It was, she realized, another quality that set him apart from the men who typically held sway over Wolfsbane Pack. Men like Silas, who wielded influence through manipulation and calculated cruelty rather than genuine strength. I will not allow you to be falsely accused of anything, Draven said finally, stopping his pacing to face her directly. Whatever scheme Silas is planning, I intend to address it before it can take root. Alira felt a flicker of alarm at this. Please, be careful. If you confront him directly, it may only confirm his suspicions about the nature of our relationship, giving him more reason to act quickly and decisively. Draven considered this, his expression thoughtful. You are right, as always. A direct confrontation would likely accelerate whatever timeline he has in mind, rather than delay it. He resumed his seat, though his posture remained tense, alert. Then we must be strategic. Garrick, is there any way to accelerate the search for surviving healers from the destroyed healing house? If we can establish a clear, documented connection between Marin and the woman who cared for me, it would provide undeniable proof of the legitimate reasons behind Alira's involvement in this matter, reasons entirely separate from any romantic implications Silas might attempt to manufacture. Garrick nodded slowly. I will send word to my contacts among the healing houses in the Northern Territories tonight. If any of them have information about surviving practitioners of the silent tradition, we may hear back within the week. Good, Draven said, though his eyes remained on Alira, dark with worry. In the meantime, I want you to be careful, Alira. Avoid situations where you might find yourself alone with Silas or Nora. If either of them approaches you with any accusation, no matter how small it seems, I want to know immediately. Alira nodded, though a small, wry smile tugged at her lips despite the tension of the moment. I have spent 6 years navigating the cruelty of this pack without your protection. I believe I can manage a few more days. Draven's expression softened slightly at this, though concern still lingered in his eyes. I do not doubt your resilience. But you should not have to navigate this alone any longer, not while I am here to help. The sentiment, simple as it was, settled warmly in Alira's chest, and for a moment, the fear that had gripped her since overhearing Silas's conversation eased slightly, replaced by something steadier, more grounded. Whatever scheme was gathering against her, she was no longer facing it entirely alone. The following days passed with a tense, watchful quality. Everyone within the small circle of trust around Alira and Draven remaining alert for any sign of Silas's plan taking shape. Hannah kept careful watch over the kitchen gossip, reporting back any concerning whispers she overheard among the other servants. Garrick maintained regular contact with his network of healers across the Northern Territories, awaiting any response regarding survivors of the silent tradition's training. Alira, for her part, threw herself into her usual duties with careful, deliberate normalcy, determined not to give Silas or Nora any visible indication that she was aware of the scheme forming against her. She continued her work in the herb garden each morning, her duties in the kitchen throughout the day, and her evening conversations with Draven, though these last had taken on a new, quieter intensity, both of them acutely aware of the danger now surrounding their continued closeness. It was during one of these evening conversations, nearly a week after Alira had first overheard Silas's plotting, that Garrick arrived at the study, with news that changed the trajectory of their investigation entirely. I have received word, he announced, slightly breathless from his hurried journey to the study, from a healer in the northern village of Thornfield. She claims to have trained alongside a mute practitioner named Marin, many years ago, at the healing house destroyed during the territorial conflicts. Alira's heart leapt at this news, and Draven straightened immediately, his full attention fixed on Garrick's words. "Does she know what became of Marin after the healing house was destroyed?" Draven asked urgently. Garrick nodded, his expression grave. "She says Marin fled the destruction, along with several other practitioners, scattering across the northern territories to avoid the conflict. She lost contact with Marin shortly after, though she recalls Marin mentioning a plan to settle somewhere quiet, somewhere she could raise a family in peace, away from the political turmoil that had destroyed their training house." "And the healer who cared for me?" Draven pressed. "Does this woman have any information about her?" Garrick's expression grew more solemn. "She recalls a healer matching that description, a woman named Wren, who trained at the same house before Marin. According to her memory, Wren was recruited by royal messengers shortly before the destruction, summoned to the capital to care for a sick child of the royal family." Draven's breath caught audibly at this confirmation, his hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. "That would have been me," he said quietly. "I would have been perhaps 5 years old at the time, already gravely ill. There is more," Garrick continued carefully. "The healer in Thornfield says Wren never returned to the healing house after her summons to the capital, and that rumors circulated afterward, suggesting she had died shortly after her arrival, though nothing was ever confirmed." A heavy silence fell over the room. Illyra watched Draven's face carefully, seeing the complex mixture of grief and confusion playing across his features. He had clearly harbored some hope, however small, that the healer who had cared for him during his illness might still be alive somewhere, waiting to be found. "My father never mentioned her death," Draven said finally, his voice tight with old, unresolved pain. "I always assumed she had simply left, once I recovered, returning to her own life, away from the royal household. I never imagined she might have died so soon after saving me." Illyra reached out instinctively, placing a gentle hand over his where it rested on the table, a small gesture of comfort that required no words. Draven looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and something in his expression shifted, the grief giving way to a quiet, grateful warmth. "Thank you," he said softly, "for being here, through all of this." Illyra offered a small, sad smile, withdrawing her hand slowly, though the warmth of the contact lingered between them. She turned to Garrick, signing quickly. "Did the healer in Thornfield say anything about why Wren might have used the same gesture Marin taught me? Is there a connection between them, beyond simply training at the same healing house?" Garrick relayed the question, then listened to Draven's translation of his own understanding before responding. "The gesture you both use," the healer in Thornfield explained, "was actually a formal greeting, taught to all practitioners of the silent tradition, a way of acknowledging another trained healer without needing words. It was meant to signal recognition, respect, and shared purpose among those who had trained together." Understanding began to dawn slowly across Illyra's face, so when I used the gesture in the courtyard, without even realizing its formal meaning, I was essentially identifying myself as connected to that same tradition, the same lineage of healers. "Precisely," Garrick confirmed, which explains why the king reacted so strongly. He recognized not just a gesture, but a formal acknowledgement, one that instantly connected you to the woman who had saved his life so many years ago. Draven nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Illyra with renewed intensity. "It was not simply coincidence then. There is a genuine, meaningful connection between us, one that predates either of our births, woven through the shared history of your grandmother and the woman who saved my life." The weight of this realization settled over the room, transforming their investigation from a simple curiosity into something far more significant, a thread connecting their two lives across decades of separation and loss. Illyra felt a strange, powerful sense of purpose solidifying within her, a feeling that whatever was unfolding between herself and Draven was meant to happen, guided by forces set in motion long before either of them had been born. But even as this realization settled warmly between them, a knock sounded at the study door, sharp and urgent, interrupting the moment entirely. Garrick moved to answer it, and Illyra watched as his expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as he listened to whatever news the messenger at the door had brought. "Your Majesty," Garrick said, turning back with a grave expression, "Alpha Edmund requests your immediate presence in the main hall. There has been an accusation raised, one that requires urgent attention." Illyra's stomach dropped, ice flooding through her veins as she understood, with terrible certainty, exactly what kind of accusation Garrick was referring to. Silas's plan, whatever form it had ultimately taken, had finally arrived. The main hall was already crowded when Draven and Alira arrived, word of the summons having spread quickly through the pack house. Alpha Edmund stood at the head of the hall, his expression grim, flanked by Silas and several other advisors. Nora stood slightly behind her father, her arms crossed, an expression of carefully controlled satisfaction on her face that made Alira's stomach twist with dread. "Your Majesty," Edmund said, bowing slightly as Draven entered, though his voice carried a heaviness that suggested he took no pleasure in the proceedings ahead. "I apologize for the urgency of this summons, but a serious matter has been brought to my attention, one that requires immediate resolution." "What matter is that?" Draven asked, his voice steady, though Alira could feel the tension radiating from him as he moved to stand beside her, a silent show of support that did not go unnoticed by the gathered crowd. Silas stepped forward, his expression carefully composed into one of reluctant duty. "Your Majesty, it grieves me to bring this forward, but concerns have been raised regarding the security of our healing stores. Several valuable herbs and tinctures have gone missing from the healing house over the past 2 weeks, items that could be dangerous if misused. Given the unusual access certain individuals have had to those stores recently, I believe a thorough investigation is warranted." Alira felt the blood drain from her face as she understood the direction of his accusation. He was not simply spreading rumors about her character. He was accusing her of theft, of stealing from the very healing supplies she and Garrick worked so carefully to maintain. "Are you suggesting," Draven said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that Alira has stolen from the healing house?" Silas spread his hands in a gesture of feigned reluctance. "I make no direct accusation, Your Majesty. I simply note that she has had unrestricted access to those stores, working alongside Garrick daily, and that her sudden prominence within the pack house has coincided suspiciously with these disappearances." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, and Alira felt the weight of dozens of eyes settling on her, some curious, some openly suspicious, fed by the rumors Nora had been carefully cultivating over the preceding days. She wanted desperately to defend herself, to explain that she had never taken anything beyond what her duties required, but the familiar frustration of her silence pressed heavily against her chest, made worse by the public nature of the accusation. "This is absurd," Garrick spoke up sharply, stepping forward from where he had followed Draven and Alira into the hall. "I have worked alongside Alira every single day for the past 3 years. I would know immediately if any supplies had gone missing under her care. She is meticulous, honest, and has never once given me reason to doubt her integrity." "With respect, Garrick," Silas said smoothly, "your fondness for the girl is well known throughout the pack house. It is understandable that you might overlook discrepancies you would prefer not to see." Garrick's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Draven stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate silence throughout the hall. "I would like to see evidence of these missing supplies," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a king accustomed to cutting through political maneuvering with direct, decisive action. "A detailed accounting, comparing current stores against previous records. If items are indeed missing, I want to know exactly what and when the discrepancy first appeared." Silas hesitated, clearly not having anticipated this direct challenge. "Your Majesty, surely such detailed accounting is unnecessary. The concern itself is sufficient grounds for a temporary removal of the accused from her current duties, pending further investigation." "No," Draven said flatly. "An accusation without evidence is not sufficient grounds for anything, particularly not the removal of someone from duties they have performed faithfully for years. If you wish to pursue this matter, you will provide concrete evidence, and it will be reviewed fairly, by someone with no personal stake in the outcome." The hall fell into tense silence, every eye now shifting between Draven and Silas, watching the unfolding confrontation, with a mixture of fascination and unease. Alira could see Silas's composure faltering slightly, his carefully constructed plan clearly not accounting for such a direct, immovable challenge from the king himself. "Very well," Silas said finally, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration. "I will have the healing house records reviewed immediately, comparing current stores against Garrick's own documentation. If discrepancies exist, they will be found." "Good," Draven said. And if no discrepancies are found, if this accusation proves baseless, I trust you will offer Alira a formal apology, in front of this same gathered assembly, for the damage done to her reputation by this public accusation. Silas's jaw tightened visibly, clearly not having anticipated such a demand, but with the entire hall watching, including Alpha Edmund himself, he had little choice but to nod stiffly in agreement. Of course, Your Majesty. If the accusation proves baseless, I will offer whatever apology is deemed appropriate. The assembly began to disperse shortly after, though whispered conversations followed Alira as she made her way back toward the servants' quarters, Hannah appearing at her side almost immediately, her expression furious. That was despicable, Hannah signed once they were alone in the relative privacy of the kitchen. Accusing you of theft, in front of the entire pack, with no actual evidence? Alira nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she signed her response. He is desperate. His plan to simply spread rumors was not moving quickly enough, or was not damaging enough to force real action. This is his attempt to remove me from the pack house entirely, using an accusation serious enough to demand real consequences. Do you think he will find evidence? Hannah asked, worry creasing her brow. Real discrepancies in the healing house records? Alira considered this carefully. She and Garrick maintained meticulous records, documenting every herb and tincture used, every patient treated. If Silas intended to manufacture evidence of theft, he would need to falsify those records somehow, a task that would require access Alira doubted he currently possessed. I do not believe genuine discrepancies exist, she signed finally, which means if he wishes to prove his accusation, he will need to create false evidence. And that is a far more dangerous game than simply spreading rumors. Hannah's expression grew grim. Be careful, Alira. A man desperate enough to falsify evidence against you is a man capable of far worse, if this first attempt fails to achieve his goals. The warning settled heavily over Alira as she made her way back to the herb garden the following morning, her usual peaceful routine now tinged with wariness, her eyes scanning the healing house shelves for any sign of tampering as she and Garrick began their careful review of the records. They worked through the morning in tense silence, cross-referencing every entry against the physical inventory remaining on the shelves, searching for any discrepancy that might give credence to Silas's accusation. By midday, they had confirmed what Alira had suspected all along. Everything accounts for perfectly, Garrick announced, setting down the final ledger with visible relief. Every herb, every tincture, matches exactly what our records indicate should remain. There is no evidence of theft. Relief flooded through Alira, though it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that Silas would not simply accept this outcome quietly. If genuine evidence did not exist to support his accusation, she feared he might attempt to create it, planting discrepancies where none had previously existed, or worse, orchestrating some incident that would appear to confirm his suspicions. Her fears proved well-founded sooner than she expected. That very evening, as she and Garrick prepared to close the healing house for the night, one of Edmund's household guards arrived, his expression apologetic but firm. I am sorry to disturb you, he said, addressing Garrick directly, but Silas has requested a formal search of the servants' quarters, specifically Alira's personal belongings, as part of the ongoing investigation into the missing supplies. Garrick's face darkened with anger. The healing house records show no discrepancies whatsoever. What possible grounds does he have for searching her personal belongings? The guard shifted uncomfortably. I am simply following orders, Garrick. Alpha Edmund has authorized the search, given the seriousness of the original accusation. Alira felt a fresh wave of dread wash over her as she processed this development. If Silas intended to plant false evidence, her own personal quarters, sparse and simple as they were, would be the easiest place to do so, with no one present to witness the deception taking place. She signed quickly to Garrick. I need to speak with Draven immediately, before this search takes place. Garrick nodded grimly, turning to the guard. We will accompany you, and I insist that the king be informed immediately, given his direct involvement in addressing this matter earlier today. The guard hesitated, clearly uncertain how to navigate the competing demands of Silas's authority and the king's evident interest in the situation, but finally nodded, leading them toward the servants' quarters, while another messenger was dispatched to inform Draven of the unfolding search. By the time they arrived at Alira's small room, a modest space, containing little more than a narrow bed, a small chest for her few belongings, and a shelf lined with pressed herbs and old books her grandmother had left her. A small crowd had already gathered, drawn by the news of the search. Silas stood near the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, though Alira could detect the barely suppressed anticipation beneath his composed exterior. "Let us proceed," Silas said, gesturing for the guard to begin the search. Alira stood rigidly in the doorway, watching as the guard moved through her sparse belongings, checking beneath her bed, opening her small chest, examining every item with careful, methodical precision. Her heart pounded with each passing moment, terrified that Silas had somehow already arranged for incriminating evidence to be planted among her few possessions. The search stretched on for several tense minutes, the gathered crowd watching in silence, until finally, just as the guard reached the small shelf containing her grandmother's old books, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "What is happening here?" Draven's voice carried easily down the corridor, and the crowd parted immediately as he strode toward the room, his expression thunderous, Garrick's messenger having clearly reached him in time. "A routine search, Your Majesty," Silas said smoothly, though his composure had visibly cracked slightly at Draven's sudden, forceful arrival. "As part of the ongoing investigation into the missing supplies." "I was under the impression," Draven said, his voice dangerously calm, "that the Healing House records showed no discrepancies whatsoever. Garrick confirmed this to me personally, not an hour ago." Silas's expression faltered further. "The records may show no discrepancies, but that does not preclude the possibility that stolen items were hidden away, rather than simply removed from the pack house entirely." Draven's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And on what evidence do you base this new theory, precisely?" The room fell into heavy, expectant silence, every eye fixed on Silas, as he struggled to formulate a response that did not reveal the increasingly desperate, baseless nature of his continued pursuit. Alira watched, her pulse racing, as the confrontation reached its breaking point, uncertain whether Silas's carefully constructed scheme was about to collapse entirely, or whether some final, damning piece of false evidence was about to be revealed. Silas opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the guard conducting the search straightened suddenly from where he had been examining Alira's small shelf of books, holding up a small pouch that had clearly been tucked behind the row of pressed herbs. "I found this, Your Majesty," the guard said, his voice uncertain as he held the pouch toward the light. "It appears to contain several dried herbs I do not recognize." A ripple of murmurs moved through the gathered crowd, and Alira felt her stomach drop, her mind racing to understand how something she had never seen before could possibly be hidden among her own belongings. She had not placed that pouch there. She was certain of it. Silas's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of triumph quickly masked beneath practiced concern. "That certainly appears suspicious," he said, stepping forward to examine the pouch more closely. "Those herbs, if I am not mistaken, closely resemble the rare tinctures reported missing from the Healing House." "That is not possible," Garrick interjected sharply, moving forward to examine the pouch himself. He opened it carefully, studying the contents with a healer's practiced eye, and after a moment, his expression shifted from alarm to confusion. "These are not from our Healing House stores. I do not recognize this particular blend at all. The composition is entirely wrong for anything we currently keep in inventory." "Perhaps," Silas said smoothly, "she obtained them through other means, intending to sell them, or use them for purposes beyond simple healing." Alira felt a surge of frustration and fear so intense it nearly overwhelmed her ability to think clearly. She had never seen that pouch before in her life, had certainly never placed anything suspicious among her belongings. Someone had planted it there, deliberately, to manufacture exactly the kind of evidence Silas needed to justify her removal from the pack house. She turned desperately to Draven, her hands moving in quick, urgent signs. "I have never seen that before. I do not know where it came from. Someone must have placed it there." Draven's expression remained carefully controlled, though Alira could see the barely restrained fury simmering beneath his composed exterior as he processed her words. He turned to address the gathered crowd directly, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "I find it remarkably convenient," he said, his tone icy, "that this pouch was discovered only after Silas himself insisted on this search, despite Garrick's own records showing no evidence of missing supplies. I would like to know exactly who has had access to this room prior to today's search. Silence fell over the gathered crowd. Elira watched as several faces shifted uncomfortably, clearly recalling something relevant to the question, but hesitant to speak against Silas's evident influence. Finally, a young servant girl near the back of the crowd, one Elira recognized as working closely with Nora's household, stepped forward hesitantly. I saw someone near the servants' quarters yesterday evening, she said quietly, her eyes darting nervously toward Nora, who stood rigid near her father, her earlier satisfaction now replaced by visible tension. I did not think much of it at the time. Who did you see? Draven pressed gently, encouraging the girl's honesty. The servant hesitated only a moment longer before answering. I saw Nora, Your Majesty, near this very room. I assumed she was simply passing through, but now that I think of it, she seemed to be lingering near the doorway for some time. Every eye in the room turned toward Nora, whose face had drained of color, her earlier composure crumbling entirely under the weight of the accusation now leveled against her. That is a lie, Nora said, her voice sharp with panic. I do not know what that girl thinks she saw, but I certainly did not plant anything in this room. No one has accused you of planting anything, Draven said quietly, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made Nora visibly flinch. Yet, the implication hung heavily in the air, and Elira watched as Silas's expression shifted from confidence to something closer to alarm, clearly recognizing how quickly the situation was unraveling around his careful scheme. Your Majesty, Silas said quickly, attempting to regain control of the narrative. Surely this is simply a misunderstanding. My daughter has no reason to plant false evidence against... Draven interrupted, his voice cutting through Silas's attempted explanation with brutal efficiency. I have heard, from multiple sources, that your daughter has expressed significant concern over how my presence here might affect her prospective betrothal to a lord from the Eastern Pax. I have also heard, from Elira herself, a conversation she overheard between you and another advisor, discussing ways to discourage what you termed unwanted attention, ways that did not require direct confrontation. Silas's face went pale, clearly realizing that his private scheming had been overheard and reported to the king with far more detail than he had anticipated. I believe, Draven continued, his voice deceptively calm despite the fury simmering beneath it, that a formal investigation is warranted, not into Elira's conduct, but into the conduct of those who orchestrated this false accusation against her. Alpha Edmund, who had been watching the unfolding confrontation with growing alarm, finally stepped forward, his expression grave. Your Majesty, if these accusations against Silas and Nora prove accurate, this represents a serious breach of trust within my own pack. I will not tolerate false accusations designed to manipulate the outcomes of political arrangements, regardless of the family responsible. Thank you, Alpha Edmund, Draven said, inclining his head slightly in acknowledgement. I trust you will conduct a thorough investigation, and that appropriate consequences will follow, should these suspicions be confirmed. Silas began to protest further, his voice rising with increasing desperation, but Edmund cut him off with a sharp gesture. Enough, Silas. You will submit to questioning, along with your daughter, regarding the events of yesterday evening. Until this matter is resolved, I am suspending your advisory duties within this pack house. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Silas, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief, was escorted away by two of Edmund's guards, Nora following behind, her earlier confidence entirely shattered, replaced by the dawning realization that her scheme had backfired catastrophically. Once the crowd had largely dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves about the dramatic turn of events, Draven turned to Elira, his expression softening from the controlled fury he had displayed moments before into something gentler, more concerned. Are you all right? He asked quietly, once only Garrick and Hannah remained nearby, having pushed their way through the departing crowd to check on Elira themselves. Elira nodded slowly, though her hands still trembled slightly with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. That was terrifying. I truly believed, for a moment, that I might be removed from the pack house entirely, based on evidence I had no way of disproving. I would not have allowed that to happen, Draven said firmly. I told you before, I do not intend to watch you be wrongfully accused without consequence. I meant that. Garrick, who had been examining the confiscated pouch more closely, looked up with a curious expression. This blend is unusual. I do not recognize the specific combination of herbs, though the base ingredients suggest it may have originated from somewhere in the Eastern Territories, rather than anywhere local to Wolfsbane Pack. Could Nora have obtained it from her prospective betrothed's family? Hannah suggested. If they hail from the Eastern Packs, it would explain the unfamiliar origin. Garrick nodded slowly. That seems likely. Which would explain why the herbs did not match anything from our own Healing House stores. A detail that nearly exposed the deception entirely, had anyone thought to examine the pouch more carefully before drawing conclusions. Draven's expression darkened further at this confirmation of premeditation. This was not a desperate, spontaneous act. Nora planned this carefully, likely with her father's knowledge and support, well before the initial accusation was even raised in the main hall. The weight of this realization settled heavily over the small group. What had begun as simple rumors and social maneuvering had escalated into a calculated, dangerous scheme designed to remove Elira from the pack house entirely, regardless of the harm it might cause to her reputation and safety. What happens now? Elira signed, looking between Draven and Garrick with evident exhaustion after the tumultuous events of the evening. Now, Draven said gently, Edmund will conduct his investigation, and I trust the truth will come to light fully, exposing the extent of Silas and Nora's scheme. In the meantime, I want you to know that you are safe. Whatever consequences follow this discovery, they will fall on those who sought to harm you, not on you. Elira felt a wave of relief wash over her, though exhaustion from the evening's events weighed heavily on her shoulders. She offered Draven a small, grateful smile, one he returned with a warmth that made her heart flutter, despite everything that had just transpired. Rest tonight, Draven said softly. Tomorrow, we can return our attention to uncovering the truth about your grandmother and Ren. I believe, given everything we have just endured together, that mystery deserves our continued attention, undistracted by the schemes of those who wish us harm. Elira nodded gratefully, allowing Hannah to guide her back toward the relative safety of the servants' quarters, though her thoughts remained fixed on the dramatic events of the evening, on the way Draven had defended her so fiercely, so decisively, against accusations that could have destroyed everything she had carefully built for herself within Wolfsbane Pack. Whatever complicated, uncertain future lay ahead for the two of them, one thing had become abundantly clear that evening. Draven's regard for her ran far deeper than simple curiosity about a shared mystery from their pasts. He had defended her not as a king protecting a valuable asset, but as someone who genuinely cared for her well-being, someone willing to risk political complications and confrontation to ensure she remained safe from those who sought to harm her. And as Elira finally settled into her narrow bed that night, the events of the day replaying in her exhausted mind, she found herself hoping, with a quiet, fierce intensity she had not allowed herself to feel in years, that whatever came next for the two of them might finally bring something good into a life that had known far too much cruelty for far too long. The days following the confrontation in the servants' quarters brought significant changes to Wolfsbane Pack. Edmund's investigation, conducted swiftly and thoroughly, confirmed exactly what everyone had suspected. Nora, with her father's full knowledge and support, had indeed planted the pouch of foreign herbs among Elira's belongings, hoping to manufacture evidence sufficient to justify her removal from the pack house before her growing closeness with Draven could complicate Nora's prospective betrothal any further. The consequences, when they came, were severe. Silas was stripped of his advisory position entirely. His family's standing within the pack diminished significantly as word of the scheme spread. Nora, whose reputation had once seemed untouchable within Wolfsbane Pack's social hierarchy, found herself facing the very isolation and mockery she had so often directed toward others, though Elira, watching from a careful distance, found she could summon little satisfaction in Nora's downfall. Cruelty repaid with cruelty, she reflected, still felt like cruelty, regardless of who deserved it. You do not need to feel sympathy for her, Hannah signed one afternoon, finding Elira in the herb garden, her expression puzzled by Elira's evident discomfort with the pack's harsh judgment of Nora. She tried to have you falsely accused and removed from your home. Whatever consequences she faces now, she brought upon herself. I understand that, Elira signed slowly, kneeling to check the progress of the winter herbs she had recently planted. I simply do not find joy in watching someone suffer, even someone who caused me harm. I have spent enough of my life being mocked and diminished. I do not wish to become someone who takes pleasure in doing the same to others, regardless of the circumstances. Hannah's expression softened at this, a small, admiring smile crossing her face. That is remarkably generous of you, given everything she put you through. Elira simply shrugged, returning her attention to the herbs, though her mind remained partially occupied with thoughts of Draven, as it so often did lately. Their evening conversations had continued uninterrupted following the resolution of Silas's scheme, though something subtle had shifted between them in the aftermath, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings neither of them had yet fully named aloud. That evening, as Elira made her way to the private study for their now customary meeting, she found Draven already waiting, though his expression carried an unusual seriousness that immediately caught her attention. Garrick received word today, he said, once she had settled into her usual seat near the fire, from another healer, one who claims to have known Ren personally, during her time at the royal capital. Elira's pulse quickened with anticipation. What did this healer say? Draven's expression grew complicated, a mixture of hope and old grief. According to this healer, Ren did not die shortly after arriving at the capital, as the rumors from Thornfield suggested. She survived my recovery, remained at the royal household for nearly a year afterward, and then left willingly, choosing to return to a quieter life, away from the political complications of court. Elira felt a surge of hope at this revelation. She survived. She might still be alive. That is my hope as well, Draven said, though caution tempered his voice. This healer lost contact with Ren after her departure from the capital, many years ago now. But she believes Ren intended to settle somewhere in the Northern Territories, perhaps even near Wolfsbane Pack itself, given her connection to your grandmother. Elira's mind raced, turning over old memories, searching for anything that might connect to this new information. Did my grandmother ever mention a friend, someone she corresponded with regularly, someone from her past training? Draven shook his head slowly. I do not know, but perhaps Garrick's records, or the Pack's own historical documents, might reveal something. If Ren settled anywhere near Wolfsbane Pack territory, there may be some trace of her presence, even after all these years. They spent the remainder of the evening poring over old Pack records, searching for any mention of a healer named Ren settling within the surrounding territories. The work was slow, painstaking, but carried a renewed sense of hope that had been somewhat overshadowed by the tension and danger of the preceding weeks. It was nearly midnight when Elira, flipping through a particularly old ledger documenting births and deaths within the Pack's outer settlements, felt her breath catch sharply. There, in faded ink, was an entry from over 20 years earlier, documenting the arrival of a new resident to a small cottage on the Pack's eastern border. She turned the ledger toward Draven, pointing to the entry with a trembling finger. The name recorded was simply W, along with a brief notation indicating the woman's occupation as a healer, skilled in herbal remedies, though notably silent, communicating only through written notes and gestures. Draven's eyes widened as he read the entry, his hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. This could be her, he said, his voice tight with barely contained hope. The timing aligns perfectly with when she would have left the royal capital. Is the cottage still standing? Elira signed urgently, once Draven had looked up from the ledger. I do not know, Draven admitted, but we should find out, as soon as possible. The following morning, Draven arranged for a small party to travel to the eastern border of Wolfsbane Pack's territory, seeking out the location described in the old ledger. Elira insisted on accompanying the group, unwilling to remain behind, while such a significant piece of the mystery potentially awaited discovery. Garrick joined them as well, along with two of Draven's most trusted guards, ensuring their safety during the journey through the less populated outer reaches of the Pack's lands. The journey took most of the day, the eastern border territory proving more remote and heavily forested than the central areas of Wolfsbane Pack, where Elira had spent her entire life. As their small party made their way through increasingly dense woodland, following the old ledger's rough description of the cottage's location, Elira found herself growing increasingly anxious, uncertain what they might find at the end of their search. It was late afternoon when they finally spotted it. A small, weathered cottage nestled among a grove of ancient oak trees, its garden overgrown, but clearly having once been carefully tended. Rows of herbs now grown wild, but still recognizable to Elira's practiced eye, as the same varieties she cultivated in her own garden back at the Pack house. The cottage itself showed signs of long abandonment, its windows dark, its doors slightly ajar, hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Elira's heart sank as she took in the scene, understanding immediately that whoever had once lived there had not done so for many years. They approached cautiously, Draven's guards checking the interior first, before allowing the rest of the party to enter. Inside, they found the remnants of a simple, quiet life, a small bed, a modest collection of healing supplies long since spoiled with age, and shelves lined with books, many of them written in the same careful, precise handwriting Elira recognized instantly from her grandmother's own journals. This was her home, Elira signed, her hands trembling as she moved through the small space, touching objects that had clearly once belonged to Ren, feeling an overwhelming sense of connection to a woman she had never met, but who had somehow shaped the course of her entire life, through the silent language passed down through her grandmother. Draven moved through the cottage with a quiet, reverent care, his eyes taking in every detail, as though searching for some final confirmation of the woman's identity. It was Garrick who found it, finally, tucked carefully within one of the books on the shelf, a small, faded portrait, clearly hand-drawn, depicting a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, her expression gentle despite the evident hardship visible in the lines of her face. Draven took the portrait with trembling hands, staring at it for a long, silent moment. "This is her," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "This is Ren. I would recognize her anywhere, even after all these years." Elira watched him carefully, seeing the complex mixture of grief and relief playing across his features, as he finally, after so many years of uncertainty, confirmed the fate of the woman who had saved his life as a child. She moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm, offering silent comfort in the way she knew best. "She must have known my grandmother," Elira signed, once Draven had composed himself enough to look up from the portrait. "This cottage is not far from where my grandmother eventually settled, before I was born." Perhaps they remained close, even after leaving the healing house together. "Perhaps," Draven agreed softly, "though it seems, from the state of this cottage, that she passed away some time ago, likely alone, forgotten by all but the memories she left behind." The realization brought a fresh wave of sadness to the discovery, tempering the relief of finally uncovering the truth, with the melancholy knowledge that Ren had spent her final years in quiet isolation, far from the royal household she had once served, far from whatever connection she might have maintained with Merrin after their shared training at the destroyed healing house. As they prepared to leave the cottage as the sun began to set, Elira found one final item among Ren's belongings that struck her deeply, a small, worn journal, filled with entries written in the same silent language Elira had learned from her grandmother, describing years of quiet, solitary healing work among the scattered settlements of the Northern Territories, interspersed with brief, tender mentions of a friend named Merrin, whose visits, though infrequent, had clearly brought Ren great joy throughout her otherwise isolated life. Elira held the journal carefully, understanding that within its pages lay the final pieces of a story that connected her own life to Draven's, in ways neither of them had ever imagined possible. Whatever came next for the two of them, this discovery had solidified something between them that went far deeper than simple curiosity or unexpected attraction, a shared history woven together by two women who had dedicated their lives to a silent tradition of healing and connection, passed down now to the two people standing quietly among the ruins of that legacy. "Thank you," Draven said softly, watching Elira as she carefully tucked the journal into her bag for safekeeping, "for helping me find this, for helping me finally understand what became of her." Elira offered him a small, warm smile, her eyes still bright with unshed tears from the emotional weight of the discovery. "We found this together," she signed, "just as we have found everything else, throughout this entire journey." Draven's expression softened further at this, and for a long moment, standing together in the fading evening light outside Ren's abandoned cottage, neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying a weight far more meaningful than any words could have conveyed. The journey back to Wolfsbane Pack passed in contemplative silence, the small party moving through the darkening forest with the weight of Ren's journal, and the emotional discoveries of the day settling heavily over all of them. Elira rode close beside Draven, occasionally glancing at him to find him lost in thought, his expression carrying the complicated mixture of grief and closure that came from finally understanding a piece of his past that had haunted him for over 2 decades. It was nearly midnight by the time they returned to the pack house, the guards dispersing to their quarters while Garrick took his leave as well, promising to examine Wren's journal more closely the following morning to help translate any entries that might prove difficult to decipher after so many years of fading ink and worn pages. Draven walked Alira back toward the servants' quarters himself, an unusual gesture that did not go unnoticed by the few pack members still awake at such a late hour, though neither of them seemed to care much for the whispered speculation that would inevitably follow. "I want to thank you again," Draven said quietly, as they reached the entrance to the servants' wing, "for everything you have done these past weeks, not just helping me uncover the truth about Wren, but for enduring everything Silas and Nora put you through, and for continuing to trust me, despite the danger my presence here has brought into your life." Alira shook her head slightly, signing her response with quiet sincerity. "You have nothing to thank me for. If anything, I should thank you. In 6 years, no one has ever fought for me the way you did, or listened to me the way you have, throughout all of this." Draven's expression grew tender at this admission, and he stepped closer, close enough that Alira had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes in the dim light of the corridor. "You deserve far more than simple gratitude, Alira. You deserve to be heard and valued and protected, not just by me, but by everyone around you, every single day, regardless of whether a king happens to be present to advocate on your behalf." Alira felt her heart racing at the intensity in his voice, at the warmth in his eyes as he studied her face in the quiet stillness of the late hour. She was acutely aware of how close they stood, of the way the corridor's silence seemed to amplify every small sound, every breath, every subtle shift of movement between them. "I find myself increasingly reluctant," Draven continued softly, "to imagine continuing my journey through the Northern Territories without you beside me. These past weeks have shown me something I did not expect to find, something far more significant than simply uncovering the truth about my past." Alira's breath caught, her hands trembling slightly as she raised them to sign a response, though she found herself momentarily unable to form the words, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment unfolding between them. Draven, seeming to understand her hesitation, reached out gently, taking her trembling hands in his own, stilling them with a warmth that spread through her entire body. "You do not need to answer with signs," he said softly. "Simply tell me, in whatever way feels right to you, whether you feel even a fraction of what I am feeling right now." Alira looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of uncertainty, finding none, only steady, patient warmth waiting for her response. Slowly, she withdrew one hand from his gentle grip, raising it to rest against his chest, directly over his steadily beating heart, a gesture that required no formal sign language to convey its meaning clearly. Draven's breath caught audibly at the contact, his own hand rising to cover hers where it rested against his chest, holding it there gently. "Alira," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know this is complicated. I know the path ahead of us, if we choose to pursue whatever is growing between us, will not be simple or easy. There will be more Silases, more Noras, more people who believe a servant girl and a king have no business finding happiness together. But I find, standing here with you now, that I do not care about any of those complications. I only care about the possibility of a future where I do not have to imagine my life without you in it." Alira felt tears welling in her eyes, though they were tears of overwhelming joy rather than sadness. She raised her free hand to sign carefully, deliberately, wanting to be certain her response carried the full weight of what she felt. "Everything you have described, I feel it as well. I have never known anyone who made me feel so completely seen, so entirely valued, exactly as I am." Draven's expression transformed at her words, relief and joy washing over his features in equal measure. Slowly giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, he leaned forward, and Alira found herself leaning toward him as well, meeting him halfway in a gentle, tender kiss that spoke more clearly than any words or signs ever could of the depth of feeling that had grown between them over the preceding weeks. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Draven rested his forehead gently against hers, a soft, contented smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I have wanted to do that for longer than I probably should admit," he confessed quietly. Alira laughed silently, her shoulders shaking, with the effort of suppressing an audible sound, though her joy was evident in every line of her expression. She signed, teasing gently. "You took long enough." Draven laughed at this, a genuine warm sound that echoed softly through the quiet corridor. In my defense, I have spent most of my adult life avoiding exactly this kind of complication. Falling for a servant girl was never part of any plan I had for my reign. Neither was falling for a king part of any plan I had for my life, Illyra signed back, a playful smile lighting her features. They stood together for a long moment longer, simply enjoying the quiet closeness of the moment, before Draven finally, reluctantly, stepped back, understanding the lateness of the hour and the need for both of them to rest after the emotional intensity of the day's events. I know this complicates things further, he said, his expression growing more serious. Word will spread quickly. Once our feelings for each other become more openly known, there will be more challenges ahead. More people like Silas who will object to a relationship between a king and a servant, regardless of the genuine connection between us. Illyra nodded, understanding the weight of his words, though she found herself unwilling to let fear of future complications diminish the joy of the present moment. Whatever challenges come, she signed, we will face them together. I am no longer facing this pack alone. I have you, and Garrick, and Hannah. That is more support than I have ever known in my entire life. Draven's expression softened further at this, and he pressed one final gentle kiss to her forehead, before finally taking his leave. Rest well, Illyra. Tomorrow, we have much to discuss, both about Ren's journal, and about what comes next for the two of us. Illyra watched him disappear down the corridor, before finally retreating to her own small room, her heart still racing with the overwhelming joy of the evening's revelations. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a long while, simply allowing herself to feel the full weight of happiness that had settled over her, a feeling so foreign after years of loneliness and cruelty that she almost did not recognize it at first. The following morning brought with it the inevitable whispers that Draven had predicted, word having somehow already spread through the packhouse that the king had been seen escorting Illyra personally back to her quarters late the previous night, his expression notably tender, in a manner that left little room for alternative interpretation. Illyra found herself the subject of curious, speculative glances throughout her morning duties, though the atmosphere surrounding these glances felt markedly different from the cruel mockery she had endured for years. Many of the pack members, having witnessed Draven's fierce defense of her against Silas's false accusations, seemed genuinely curious rather than dismissive, some even offering small, encouraging smiles as she passed. Hannah, predictably, cornered her in the kitchen almost immediately, her expression a mixture of delight and barely contained excitement. Tell me everything, she signed urgently, pulling Illyra into a quiet corner, away from the other kitchen staff. The entire packhouse is talking about how the king walked you back to your quarters last night, and I want to know exactly what happened. Illyra felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she could not fully suppress the joyful smile that spread across her face. He kissed me, she signed simply, watching Hannah's eyes widen with delighted shock. He kissed you, Hannah repeated, practically vibrating with excitement. Illyra, this is enormous. What did he say? What did you say? Tell me everything, immediately. Illyra laughed silently, shaking her head at her friend's enthusiasm, though she found herself grateful for Hannah's genuine joy on her behalf, a stark contrast to the calculating cruelty that had defined so much of her interactions within Wolfsbane Pack over the years. As she recounted the details of the previous night's conversation, watching Hannah's expression shift through delight, tenderness, and finally happy tears, Illyra felt a profound sense of gratitude settle over her. Gratitude not just for the unexpected love blossoming with Draven, but for the loyal friendship that had sustained her through even the darkest years of her silence. But even as joy filled the kitchen that morning, neither Illyra nor Hannah could have anticipated the news that would arrive by midday, news that would test the strength of Illyra and Draven's newfound bond in ways neither of them had yet imagined possible. The news arrived in the form of a royal messenger, dust-covered, and clearly having ridden hard for several days, requesting an urgent audience with King Draven regarding matters at the capital that required his immediate attention. Illyra watched from a distance as Draven received the message in the main hall, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read through the sealed correspondence delivered into his hands. That evening, when she arrived at the private study for their usual meeting, she found him standing near the window, the letter still clutched in his hand, his posture tense with evident concern. "What has happened?" she signed, once she had crossed the room to stand beside him. Draven turned to face her, his expression heavy. There has been unrest at the capital. Nothing dangerous, nothing that threatens the stability of the kingdom itself, but enough that my presence is required to address the concerns of several regional lords who have grown restless during my extended absence. I must depart for the capital within the next 2 days. Illyra felt her chest tighten with a familiar anxiety, though she forced herself to remain calm, understanding the demands placed upon a king, however inconvenient their timing might be. Of course, she signed. Your duties must come first. Draven shook his head gently, reaching out to take her hands in his own. That is not why I am troubled, he said softly. I am troubled because I do not wish to leave you here. Not now. Not after everything we have discovered and built together these past weeks. Illyra's heart ached at his words, understanding the impossible position they now found themselves in, the demands of his kingdom pulling him away, just as their relationship had finally, openly blossomed into something neither of them wished to abandon. I have a proposal, Draven continued, his grip on her hands tightening slightly with evident nervousness, an emotion Illyra had rarely seen him display. I would like you to accompany me to the capital. Not as a servant, but as my honored guest. Someone I wish to introduce properly to my court, to my advisors, to everyone who will need to understand the significance of what has grown between us. Illyra's breath caught at the magnitude of this request. Such a journey, such a public acknowledgement of their relationship, would change everything about her life, thrusting her from the relative anonymity of Wolfsbane Pack's servant quarters into the highly visible, politically charged environment of the royal court. I do not know if I am prepared for that, she signed honestly, her hands trembling slightly with the weight of the decision before her. I have spent my entire life as a servant, mocked for my silence. I do not know how to navigate the expectations of royal court life. Draven's expression softened with understanding, though determination remained clear in his eyes. You would not be navigating it alone. I would be beside you, every step of the way, along with Garrick, who has already expressed his willingness to accompany us, given his own curiosity about completing the research into the silent tradition, using the capital's more extensive historical archives. This information brought Illyra some measure of comfort, though the enormity of the decision still weighed heavily upon her. What of Hannah? She signed. I do not wish to leave her behind, not after everything she has done for me. She would be welcome to accompany us as well, Draven assured her quickly. I would ensure she has a respected position within the capital's household staff, one that reflects her value as your closest friend and confidant. Illyra felt a fresh wave of gratitude at Draven's evident consideration for the people who mattered most to her. His willingness to ensure her transition to this new life would not require sacrificing the relationships that had sustained her through the darkest years of her silence. She spent the following day in careful contemplation, seeking counsel from both Hannah and Garrick as she weighed the magnitude of the decision before her. Hannah, predictably, expressed immediate enthusiasm for the opportunity, though she took care to remind Illyra that the choice needed to reflect Illyra's own desires, not simply Hannah's excitement on her behalf. This is your life, your decision, Hannah signed seriously, during a quiet conversation in the herb garden that had become such a meaningful sanctuary for Illyra over the years. I will support whatever you choose, whether that means following you to the capital, or remaining here at Wolfsbane Pack if that is what you need. Illyra considered her friend's words carefully, understanding the weight of loyalty and support Hannah had always offered her, regardless of circumstance. I want you with me, she signed finally, if you are willing, but I understand if the capital feels like too significant a change for you as well. Hannah's expression brightened with a warm, genuine smile. Illyra, I have spent my entire life within the walls of Wolfsbane Pack. The chance to see the capital, to build a new life alongside my closest friend, is not something I would ever wish to decline. Wherever you go, I intend to follow, exactly as I always have. This assurance settled something anxious within Illyra's chest, and by the time evening arrived, bringing with it her final conversation with Draven before his scheduled departure, she found herself approaching the decision with growing clarity and confidence. I will come with you, she signed, once she had settled into her now familiar seat near the study's fire, watching Draven's expression light with evident relief and joy at her words. To the capital. Whatever challenges await us there, I would rather face them beside you than remain here, safe but separated from everything that has grown between us these past weeks. Draven crossed the room quickly, kneeling before her chair so that their eyes met directly, his expression carrying an intensity that made Alira's heart race. "Thank you," he said softly. "I promise you, Alira, whatever challenges the capital presents, I will ensure you are treated with the respect and honor you deserve. You will never again have to endure the kind of cruelty you faced here at Wolfsbane Pack, not while I have breath in my body to prevent it." Alira felt tears of joy welling in her eyes at the sincerity of his promise, and she leaned forward, closing the distance between them for a soft, lingering kiss that spoke of the hope and possibility now stretching out before them, a future neither of them could have imagined just a few short weeks earlier, when Draven had first arrived at Wolfsbane Pack for what was meant to be nothing more than a routine diplomatic visit. The following morning, as preparations for departure bustled throughout the pack house, Alira found herself standing once more in the same courtyard where everything had begun, where Nora's cruel mockery had first drawn Draven's attention through the simple, dignified gesture her grandmother had taught her so many years before. The irony of the location was not lost on her as she watched the final preparations for their journey, the same crowd that had once laughed at her expense, now gathering to witness her departure alongside the Alpha King himself, many faces carrying expressions of genuine warmth and respect that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Alpha Edmund approached her as the final preparations concluded, his expression carrying a formal respect that Alira had never before received from pack leadership. "I want to offer my sincere apologies," he said quietly, "for the treatment you endured within these walls, treatment that I should have recognized and addressed long before circumstances forced the matter into the open. You deserved better from your own pack, and I am sorry that it took a king's intervention to secure the respect you were always owed." Alira accepted this apology graciously, signing her response while Garrick, standing nearby, translated for those unable to understand the silent language directly. "Thank you, Alpha Edmund. I hold no resentment toward Wolfsbane Pack as a whole. I simply hope that my experience here might encourage greater kindness toward those who communicate differently than others, in whatever form that difference might take." Edmund nodded solemnly, clearly taking her words to heart, and Alira felt a small measure of closure settle over her as she prepared to leave behind the only home she had ever known, stepping forward into an uncertain but promising future. As their small party finally departed through the pack house gates, Draven riding close beside her, Hannah and Garrick following behind with the modest collection of belongings they had chosen to bring with them, including Wren's precious journal, now carefully preserved for further study at the capital's archives, Alira found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 years of silence, 6 years of mockery and diminishment, had led her here, to this unexpected joyful beginning. The gesture that had once marked her as different, as lesser, in the eyes of those who mocked her inability to speak, had ultimately revealed itself as the very thing that connected her to a king, to a shared history of healing and compassion, passed down through generations of silent practitioners, who had dedicated their lives to caring for others, despite society's frequent dismissal of their worth. As Wolfsbane Pack disappeared behind them, replaced by the open road stretching toward the capital and whatever future awaited them there, Alira reached out and took Draven's hand, a simple, wordless gesture that carried within it all the hope, gratitude, and quiet joy that had blossomed from what had once been her deepest source of shame. Draven glanced over at her, his expression soft with affection, and squeezed her hand gently in return, no words necessary between them, their silent language having long ago become more meaningful than any spoken words could ever hope to convey. Together, they rode toward the capital, toward a future neither of them could fully predict, but one they were determined to face together, hand in hand, voice and silence intertwined into something far stronger than either had ever known alone. The girl who could not speak had finally found someone who understood that her silence had never been a weakness to overcome, but simply another language worth learning, worth honoring, worth loving completely, exactly as it was.